Hello, thank you for coming. I would just like to remind you guys to please keep at least 6 feet apart. Don't share anything that's in the bags. Everyone has the same thing in the bag, so don't worry. So, I'm pleased to welcome Ebony Morgan as the first Be Speaker of the season. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is also Crystal. I'm the chair of the BEseries. And Ebony is a crisis worker for Cahoots, the mobile crisis response team in Eugene and Springfield that responds to nonviolent crises so police don't have to. Along with working in the field, she helps coordinate the program and is a registered nurse. She brings her background in healthcare, field experience, and passion for community wellness to the conversation today. She'll be talking with us about Cahoots, her personal motivators, and the effects of social injustice on public health and safety. Please join me in welcoming Ebony Morgan.
Hi, thank you, Crystal. Hi, everybody. It is wonderful to be here. Like she said, my name's Ebony. I appreciate you spending this time here today. I'm here to talk with you about my work with Cahoots, my journey to get here, and some of what inspires me. I'm going to turn on my slides for you real quick. So I chose to call this Be Help because it's the common thread through all of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Our society has a lot of room for improvement when it comes to helping one another. And I believe, and research shows, that a sense of community is really important to the human experience. Despite the fact that we know that, showing up unarmed when someone's in crisis and offering them support is still seen as a radical move. If you're not familiar, Cahoots is part of the public safety system in Eugene and Springfield. We provide a unique alternative to police in times of crisis. An EMT and a crisis worker respond to calls, offering support to community members that need it. I currently work as a crisis worker on the Cahoots team and as the communications coordinator. I'm also a registered nurse. I'm 30 years old. I'm biracial. My dad was black and mom white. I spend my free time hanging out with loved ones as the pandemic lets me, and finding all the dogs that I can, because that's my other secret passion. My hope for the presentation today is that everyone here will learn something, and perhaps something that inspires me will also inspire you. Personally and professionally, I'm extremely passionate about public health and social justice. I lump them together because they're fully intertwined concepts. As a nation, I don't think we can truly prioritize public health without making systemic changes to address an equitable and just society. It does not feel political or radical to me to say that everyone should have the chance to reach their highest possible level of health. When our health suffers, mental or physical, so does everything else in our life. And we know this, but it's not reflected in our practices. One of my personal motivators is the prevalence of mental health. The CDC tells us that mental illnesses are among the most common health conditions in the United States. 1 in 5 Americans will experience a mental illness in a given year. More than 50% will be diagnosed with a mental illness or disorder at some point in their life. With these statistics, the odds are quite high that we're gonna be impacted by the mental health of someone around us, if not our own. I am no exception to that. 1 in 25 Americans lives with a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. And serious mental illness impacted my family growing up. I didn't understand it at the time, but now that I do, that experience really fuels my passion for advocacy and recognizing that this impacts people in all corners of the world. On top of that exposure, I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in high school. and I'm intimately familiar with what it feels like to try your absolute hardest, yet not be able to reach that bar and not know why. I'm lucky to have had the support I did and to continue to have access to resources that empower me to be successful at things that do not come easily to me. It was incredibly difficult for me to graduate from high school. If you had told me that I would eventually apply to nursing school with a 4.0 GPA, I would not have believed you for half a second. I still can't believe that I did that. I hadn't figured out any of the hacks to my own brain yet. And I don't know if anyone else in this space had ever been told that they would do really well if they could just figure out how to apply themselves. But I heard that a lot growing up. And what I didn't realize was that apply myself meant doing all of the things that I was terrible at, like showing up on time and remembering deadlines and finishing my homework and staying organized. So without the tools that I wound up finding to help me through that, I struggled. I pulled it off. And I figured out now that the best hack to helping myself focus is choosing subjects that I'm passionate about. My brain is not a good one for mundane and repetitive tasks, but when it comes to talking about things that I think we need to address as a society, it's pretty effective. It's boredom that I can't seem to manage, so I've chosen a path that's not boring.
Test one. Okay, sorry.
Is that better? Okay. So despite the prevalence of mental illness, only 20% of adults with a diagnosable mental disorder saw a mental health provider within the last year. This also comes from the CDC. And the barriers to accessing mental health care are almost infinite. There's high cost, there's lack of adequate insurance coverage, especially in our area, but there's a lack of available providers of all the people that are involved in healthcare. There's a very small portion that choose to go into mental health care. Access is also impacted by race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and where one lives. The other factor that I think statistics forget to include is stigma and the barrier for people around accepting that they might need some support in that way. Sometimes as Cahoots will show up to offer services and people will automatically tell us that they aren't crazy when they don't need us. And my first step is to normalize crisis for clients because everybody has crisis. It doesn't matter where you live or how old you are or what you have accomplished in your life. You're gonna run into a crisis, and sometimes we need people to help us through that time. And that's fine, that's so human, it's so valid. So I begin by normalizing the fact that we're all gonna run into things that we need support to get through. The fact that mental disorders are so common and yet so misunderstood is a huge motivator for the path that I'm on. It lines up with another significant motivator for me, and my favorite slide, which is one of my absolute favorite photos. This is one of the few pictures of my dad that I have. The handsome gentleman holding on to me is my father, Charles Morgan, and he was the kind of man that you couldn't miss. He was 6'5", he was smart, strong, and pretty fearless and opinionated. My family and the people that knew him and tell me about him describe him as a king and a leader. I don't remember a lot, but I remember his strength, and I just remember him being big and to me like invincible, you know? But he wasn't. He wasn't invincible. And my father, Charles Morgan, died during a police encounter here in Eugene in the mid-90s. He was 25. I was 5 years old. And 25 when he died. I'm 30 now, so that's The last 5 years for me have by far been the most productive and my most thoughtful years. And I can't imagine not having had this time to accomplish the things I have. His death made the front page of the paper when it happened, which I wish I could be proud of, but unfortunately the paper used very different words to describe him than my family does and I would, which is still common practice today. There were no hashtags then. There was no social media to live stream. There was no way to acknowledge that this canyon of a scar had been left on my family the same way it was left on so many others and still is. But at the time, we might not have had the way to make it public, but there was still plenty of racism present. And this is something you're going to hear me say many times tonight, but racism is a public health crisis, period. It is deadly. It takes, as one example, Black lives far more prematurely in many ways, including police brutality, inadequate health care, environmental injustice, and now an increased risk of contracting and then dying from COVID-19. The factors that influence health are not dispersed equally among everybody, and that is a pandemic. That is a problem. Systemic racism kills people of color in far more ways than just by a public lynching, right? Of course, that's the most obvious and the most alarming, but it is not the only or the greatest threat. Systemic racism is a pandemic just as much as COVID-19 is. We're just used to it. The way that we are rallying together to protect ourselves against this virus is a way that we could rally together to protect ourselves against systemic inequity, against discrimination, against deadly causes. The way that I lost my father and the way that racism shapes all of the systems in our nation makes me super passionate about alternative methods. Alternatives to policing is part of what I'm working with right now, but also creative approaches to any of our current systems excite me. Let's consider that people with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by a police officer, according to a study by the Treatment Advocacy Center. Black Americans are 6 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police. We also can't ignore that Black people and people of color in general are more likely to struggle getting access to treat their mental health conditions, therefore more likely to have an untreated mental illness. And the way that these factors compound on each other and intersect to create risk is exponential. We're looking at a lot of flaws in this system, and I say that having seen our healthcare system from a lot of angles. Initially, I worked for a health insurance company, the local Medicaid, and then I worked in the emergency department for a few years, and I saw the way that when you can't access services in a preventative way, you wind up in the emergency room paying the emergency room bill instead. And then I spent a year at a primary care office that was holistic. We had naturopaths, and we had primary care providers, and we had physical therapy and counseling all in one room, and it was really fantastic. Then I started nursing school, and during school I started working for Whitebird, helping people sign up for health insurance, which is where I learned that there are a lot of barriers to that. In January of this year, a few months before I graduated nursing school, I finally applied for Cahoots because I knew that the work would be meaningful to me. I discovered Cahoots when I was working in the emergency department. They would bring in patients to be seen, and so would paramedics, and so would the police department. But the way that Cahoots advocated for the patients and supported them through the check-in process always stood out to me. They would sit with you through the check-in, and they would talk to the nurse for you and make sure that the hospital understood the goal of your visit and really help articulate how it was going to look and remove some of that barrier to the client that might not necessarily understand the process. And I wanted to work with them so bad, but I was hesitant. The concept of the work was intimidating, and I was honestly unsure about working so closely with the police, having my own associated trauma. Cahoots stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. When someone calls 911 or the non-emergency police number for help with a non-violent and a non-criminal situation, Cahoots might get dispatched instead. This is especially true if the call has a mental health component. And I'll get into it into more detail, but briefly, the dispatchers communicate to the team that we have a call. The 2 humans that are working on the van will drive to the location and show up and offer support to whatever client is on scene. It's 1 EMT and 1 crisis worker, and the intervention can look a lot of different ways from there. Eugene has had this alternative to police response in place for 31 years, since 1989, offered as a program of Whitebird Clinic. Whitebird, as a larger organization, the goal is to provide compassionate, humanistic healthcare and supportive services to individuals in our community so that everyone receives the care that they need. The variety of programs that we offer are intended to improve access to our clients by having one spot that you can go and get those needs met. We provide these services for people without first asking if they deserve care because we know that they do. We know this because they are human, and that is enough. We think of ourselves a little bit like the safety net below the safety net. And we offer a medical clinic, a dental clinic. We have Hoots, which is similar to the model of Cahoots, but goes to high schools to chat with students there. There's a crisis line that you can call for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's never gone down since it was initiated before Cahoots was an official program. And that can always be reached by phone. We have a lot of different programs, but they all try to work together to wrap services around a client to make sure that they get the needs met that they have. And we all operate with some similar guiding principles. For Cahoots, we use a client-centered approach. We help people identify their own needs and figure out what it is that would help them meet that need. We're a voluntary service. We can't force you to do anything. We're here to help you have the best outcome that you can. We provide trauma-informed care, which means we treat the whole person. And when we're talking to you, we consider the effects of your past trauma and your life experiences and how we might have come to current coping mechanisms when we're trying to understand your behaviors and what might be helpful to you from here. We believe in harm reduction, so we support policies and interventions that are designed to lessen the negative social or physical consequences that are associated with a variety of human behaviors. And we're unarmed. We rely solely on verbal de-escalation. And to do that, new staff undergo more than 500 hours of field training and more than 30 classroom hours before being considered fully trained. Being unarmed, we have to have some tools. And most of the tools that we use are our training, which I consider kind of a toolkit, right? I'm not going to use every tool on every call, but I'm going to have them all and be able to adapt and figure out what your needs are and how to meet them. Along with the training, we've got our van, which we can use to transport people to an appropriate service if they need to be connected with something other than our services. And in the van, we'll carry basic gear, supplies, outdoor gear, socks, water. We try not to purposefully just deliver supplies, but often we find that when somebody's in a crisis, supporting those basic needs can be the first step towards helping resolve that crisis. If nothing else, food tends to be a really good way to build rapport, which I was not surprised to find because it is the quickest way to be my friend. I will approach clients sometimes and they will tell me in no uncertain terms that they do not want my help. And I will ask if they want some fruit leather or a granola bar, and all of a sudden, they got a couple minutes to let me know how they're doing. Aside from snacks, not the most important thing we carry, just my favorite, we also carry our med bag, which is for our medics, and it holds basic medical supplies. We can do wound care. We can check on non-emergent medical things if you're worried about something, but you don't necessarily think you need to see a doctor, but you want to kind of figure out what's going on. We can check it out and give you some advice. See if we think you should see a doctor, kind of go from there. We have more intense medical equipment in case we're first on a scene that requires some life-saving measures. And we carry our police radios for communication. So if we happen to be first on a scene for somebody who had overdosed on opiates, for example. We carry Narcan, we can administer that medication, and we can let them know over the radio that we're gonna need medics, we're gonna need paramedics to get en route and show up as well. And that can happen efficiently. So being plugged into the system in that way helps us be an effective pillar in the public safety model. Cahoots calls come in through the non-emergency line or the 911 number. And the call takers and dispatchers are trained to recognize nonviolent situations that have a behavioral health component and route those calls to Cahoots. The call taker will take details from you, including the location, the hope that you're trying, like what you're trying to get out of the call, the services being requested. They'll ask for a first name, but not a last name for your privacy, and some identifying pieces. If you're asking us to look for somebody else, what do they look like? How would we know that we found them? They rank the calls by priority or urgency. Like if somebody wants us to transport them to the hospital, but it's for something chronic and we know that they're stable, and somebody else calls in because they're having suicidal ideation, we're gonna respond to the suicidal subject first. So those calls get prioritized by dispatch, and then we will go out to wherever that location is within the city limits of Eugene or Springfield. We will use our radios to communicate with dispatch, and they'll communicate with us if we need police backup or paramedic backup. If we're transporting someone, we'll let them know. And on a personal note, it's a really interesting component for me to hear the police radio all day. I find it has lessened my nervousness because I hear them all the time. But I also hear them all the time. And so I've kind of, through this work, found the truth that police officers are people, and they communicate like everybody else, and they do their job like anybody shows up to do their job. And my lens, my demands come to this system. I think that people as individuals only hold so much power. I think it's the systems that we have in place that are creating these dynamics that are causing so much problem. Anyway, we will show up on scene and provide crisis intervention. And crisis intervention is a really big concept. It's kind of a vague term, but it comes up a lot in my work. And the definition of a crisis is a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And that vague definition accurately reflects the scope of our work. It's broad. It's hard to give an idea without giving certain examples. But we are sometimes referred to as behavioral health first responders. We contract with the police departments to provide an alternative to that response when it's appropriate. And we just meet you where you are to offer you help. This can look like crisis counseling, approaching you during a time of acute distress and trying to help figure out what next steps are going to support you the most. It can look like suicide prevention, mediation, or grief counseling, which is something people don't often think of us for. I responded recently to a call where a sibling had found their sibling who had overdosed and did not make it. And instead of the standard, which would be police responding and then going through the steps that are really abrupt and not very gentle alone, we got to respond as well and provide a component of support that was part of the system. I understood the steps, but I was able to just sit with the client and be present and say, what kind of steps do we need to do right now? Who could be here to support you? And how do we get a hold of them? They're going to ask you these questions. Are you ready for that yet? No. Okay, I'll give you 5 more minutes. You can think about it, and then they're going to come in and talk with you. Being a buffer between some of the more methodical systems and the grace that it takes to be a human and go through the human experience is one of the greatest privileges of this job. Meeting people where they're at and being able to recognize that what's happening is a completely human experience and they're not in it alone is why I go every day. I think too often we're so focused on fixing a problem that we forget to just recognize that we're all in this together and everybody's doing the best that they can. We'll also go on welfare checks. If you're worried about somebody else, maybe they sent you a weird text message, and they don't usually say things like that, but they just sent you a text that says like goodbye, and you don't know what that means. We can go by their place if you let us know where it is and check and make sure that they're okay, offer them some services, and if they tell us they're fine, then we'll leave them alone, but if they're not fine, we'll offer some support. We can respond for substance abuse if people are having a housing crisis. Like I mentioned, we can do first aid and non-emergency medical care. And largely what we do is connect people to resources and inform them of resources that are available. As a standalone, we can meet you where you're at and help you to the next moment, but we don't necessarily offer, we're not treatment counselors. We can't come up with, too long-term of a plan with you. We're just gonna get you out of your immediate crisis to a place where you're a little more stable and then let you go from there. So what can we connect you with that's gonna help you from that next point? If that looks like transporting someone to an appropriate service, we can do that as well. One piece of our work that people are often curious about is de-escalation. It's a word that's brought up a lot in the context of public safety, but it's kind of a vague idea to folks. And I'll explain it a little bit. De-escalation takes practice, and it also takes time, which is why I appreciate that as part of our public safety model, Cahoots gets to do this, because we don't necessarily have to rush it. It's defined as a reduction of the intensity of a conflict or potentially violent situation. What it means to me is helping someone who is having an intense emotional response or experience get to a grounded, safer space. And I find the strongest and most effective tool for de-escalation is sincerity. I don't know how many of you have been escalated and had someone like a partner or a parent just tell you to calm down, but it's an extremely ineffective way to approach that. I don't think anyone in the history of being told to calm down has ever calmed down. I think that that is not the method. Instead, I find that being flexible with the response and just recognizing that you might not really appreciate the way that someone's presenting their escalated state. You might not like the way they're talking to you, maybe they're yelling, maybe it's aggressive. But getting it to change, if that's a responsibility you're trying to take on, is going to take a controlled response from you. The first step is staying safe. Scene safety is our number one concern at all times. We want to make sure nobody gets hurt. In 31 years of operating, we've never had a serious injury or a death between client or staff member on Cahoots in relation to providing services. And that's because we're careful. We're always aware of the potentials for danger. And while keeping that in mind, to de-escalate somebody else, you have to stay calm. Our bodies have a natural fight or flight response that kicks in when we're in a high stress situation. Your heart will race and your breathing will increase, and we can all have a different kind of response, but it's natural to meet somebody's energy where they're at. And rather than escalating with someone, the trick to de-escalation for me is bringing them to where you are. You use your body language and your tone to stay calm and stay consistent. You can hold boundaries and try to communicate, find out what would be helpful. But really, it's the level, language, tone, and body language. I do a lot of kneeling in my 12-hour shifts, a significant amount of squatting, meeting you at your eye level. If somebody's sitting on a sidewalk, I'm going to probably just sit next to you. And it's an effort to demonstrate that active listening, right? I am here with you in this moment, and I am not judging the way that you are responding to this thing. I have no idea what happened before I got here, and I'm not pretending to. All I'm trying to do is make sure that from here, you have a better outcome. So whatever's going to be helpful. I had to break the habit when I started on the team of putting my hands on my hips, because that's what I do when I'm kind of uncomfortable, is just retreat a little bit like this, but when I'm 6 feet tall and I'm standing next to you and you're sitting on a curb or something, and I put my hands on my hips, it's a really authoritative pose. And I never really thought about that till it was pointed out to me. So I've had to learn different ways to approach a scenario, and a lot of that includes like open hands. All these things I think people have kind of heard are like warm and welcoming gestures are actually really key to de-escalation because people are paying a lot of attention to you in that time. And when you're escalated like that, you're looking for threats. And so presenting yourself as a non-threat is a really good way to start getting through. The other thing I'll ask myself is if what's being communicated to me is how rational is it? Because if someone's presenting me a lot of irrational ideas, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's not necessarily a great idea to just argue that, right? And if someone's telling me, say, I respond to a call with you, and you tell me that you're surrounded by people that are trying to hurt you, and I look around and I don't see anybody. If I just say, well, there's nobody there, you're fine. I've broken your trust. I've told you that I'm not believing you, that I don't see it, so I don't think it's true, and I can't really de-escalate you from there. I haven't built any rapport with you. So instead, what I hear when someone says that is that they feel unsafe. And maybe I just don't even acknowledge that component. I just say, if that's what you're experiencing, and I'm not seeing the same thing, I'm not sure how to be helpful, but what would make you feel more safe? I think your priority right now is being safe, right? If you think people are trying to hurt you, where do you think you need to be? What do you think you need? Have you ever felt like this before? What helped then? So it's not necessarily focusing on what's being brought to you as trying to redirect the client's energy in a direction that might have a more constructive outcome. How can we get to some kind of resolution for this crisis? And it's empowering the client and respecting their autonomy, their right to decline services, their right to be upset. Who am I to tell you not to be upset? I don't know what you're upset about. If you want to be upset, that's fine, but what are we going to do? So it's just reminding people that they have choices, largely. And if I can identify some of those choices, what are they? Do you like this or this? You know, let's say staying where you're at is not an option. We have to leave this space. Do you want to just go outside and figure it out? Do you want to ride somewhere? What do you think we need to do to make this go better? People like to have choices and don't necessarily like to be told what to do, which I think is valid because neither do I. Cahoots is not law enforcement, and we are not trained in law enforcement. We do not have the same authority as police. There are certain situations that would not be appropriate for us since we're unarmed and we don't have lights and sirens, and we are a voluntary service. If there's a violent scene or weapons are involved in the call, we're definitely not going to respond alone. We might respond with police to that scene, and once the scene is safe, they can leave us there to do what we do. But there are certain components that I just like to clarify for folks because I never want anyone to call for Cahoots and be surprised by the response that they get. Dispatch will let you know what service they're going to send you, and it's always safe to ask for Cahoots as well if you think that there's a component that we can be helpful for. But if it's criminal or dangerous, they're likely going to send law enforcement as well, because that's their job, and we are not here to do their job. We're here to do our job and support them in the things that we're trained to do. Sometimes there's an overlap, and we'll respond with police or paramedics or both. Sometimes you get everybody. As Cahoots, we can't force anyone to get care. So there are times where if someone's a danger to themselves or others, and we're not having success with our tools keeping them safe, or they refuse to engage with us, we might have to call for police backup. It doesn't happen often. In 2019, we were involved in almost 21,000 calls for service, and we called for police backup after we arrived on scene alone only 311 times. So most of the times, the tools that we use and the interventions that we can provide are effective for the calls that we go on. We combine an EMT and a crisis worker because medical and mental health are equally important components of overall health. The National Institute of Mental Health reports that mental illness, especially depression, increases the risk for many types of physical health problems, like stroke or heart disease. And vice versa, the presence of having a chronic mental or a chronic health issue can increase your risk for mental illness. So they often overlap. And when we arrive on scene, we bring the medical and the crisis perspectives because it allows us to have a more holistic approach to each call. I responded to a call the other day for a human who was anxious. And I was the crisis worker, so I expected to do some counseling. And I could talk to anxious people all day, practice that. And I got there, and conversation was not helping. He was breathing quickly. He was kind of sweaty, and he was short of breath. And all of those things can happen when you're anxious. They can also happen when you're short on oxygen. And as a nurse, I was super aware of that risk. And I made this slide simply just to show you how much anxiety is so tricky, because when you're feeling these things and you know this, it's really hard to not think that you're having a medical issue. And so bringing Cahoots and having that mental health component and medical health component where we can evaluate the situation and figure out what it is a way to try to start differentiating. Because of course there are symptoms that aren't on that list, and we're familiar with those. So when he stood up and got more short of breath, I asked him if he had any chest pain, and he told me yes. And he said, but can't that be a symptom of anxiety? I've had that before with my anxiety. And I said, it absolutely can. But has it ever felt like this? And he said, no. And I said, we're gonna get the paramedics on the way. And my partner used his radio to request them. And they came and they agreed with us that it might be a cardiac issue or a heart problem. And so they transported him to the hospital that's appropriate for that. And in that time, he told me, he said he didn't wanna go. He said, I don't have insurance. I don't wanna go. And we talked with him and we talked him through it and let him know that Whitebird can help you sign up for health insurance along the way. We can do that once you're done. You can come back by and we'll support you through that process. So that's where having these different abilities to support clients comes in so handy. We had to call paramedics because we are not an ambulance. Our protocol, anytime we have somebody with chest pain, is to have paramedics come out and do their own assessment to make sure that it's not a heart problem. We are not considered an ambulance for a lot of reasons. Our scope is not the paramedic scope, but there are things that we encounter in the field that are appropriate for us more so than needing to go by ambulance to the hospital. We can take you for free. Every service that Cahoots will offer you is free. Sometimes medics will respond to something and find that their response is a little too intense. They'll show up with the fire truck and the ambulance and like 8 people. And if you're anxious and it's truly anxiety, they are not prepared to deal with that. They're like, you're not dying, so we're gonna leave. But what they get to do here is call Cahoots and let us know and say, we weren't able to support this person. It's not for us, but it is for you. Could you come by? And instead of just leaving that person to say like, well, you're not dying, so I guess you're on your own, we'll show up and we'll sit down and we'll try to get you to a space where you feel a little safer. And we can try to help figure out, is there a route to this? Does this happen often? What tools do you have? What helps you? We were not designed to replace any part of the current structure. We were designed to support it and fill gaps that the current system is not intended to handle, especially mental health concerns, homelessness, and behavioral health issues. We're not a fix-all solution, and fundamentally, we are still a reactive response. We have not changed the nature of public safety by any means, but we are looking at doing it a little bit differently. When you look at the function of public safety as we know it, it's so apparent that our systems are designed to react. It's true for our healthcare systems, and recent changes have pushed for some preventative medical care to be more accessible, but we have a long way to go towards true accessibility. When I zoom out to consider an ideal situation, I imagine a world where we don't need Cahoots either. We don't need a crisis response because we have prevented people from going into a crisis state. We have met your basic needs and your emotional needs and your health needs enough that you are stable and that we have a society of stable people. I don't know if anybody's encountered this before, but this is Maslow's pyramid of needs. And I'm not going to get into it too much, but the goal at the top of this period is self-actualization. That's where you figure out what your purpose is. You feel really good about it. You know that what your potential is, and you feel motivated to meet that full potential. The steps below that pyramid are the things that it takes to be able to do that. The bottom layer of this pyramid is the physiological needs. It is the baseline requirements to existing as a human, and they include air, water, food, shelter, sleep, the right to use a bathroom. The idea here is that if you can't meet the needs at the bottom, how are you going to reach the top? And as a society, how often do we expect that people are going to be able to function in the ways that we expect and demand while we are not having systems in place to meet those basic needs at the bottom? If you're struggling to sleep because you don't have somewhere to be, how could we possibly expect you to have the confidence and the free time to go out and find a job or go out and get yourself an education? And some people do. It's not to say that you can't. It's just to say, is that a fair expectation that we have? That people will be able to succeed in our society when we haven't given them the fundamental needs to be a person? Safety and health comes right after the physiological needs, and it's really about just having a safe environment, a routine, and some security and stability. That is where, as people, we start to find a groove, and we start to feel like we know what to expect. And the point of me showing you this is to highlight the order of priority. This concept is present constantly in our work on Cahoots, and it helps set a framework for me of considering the needs of our communities. 60% of the clients that we help on Cahoots are unhoused. And the 60-40 split makes sense to me because when you are unhoused, your ability to meet those basic needs is significantly decreased. In one day, if you need to access services to be able to get some food and take a shower, and then maybe go get your prescription across town, or go find an option or get some new gear or supplies from somewhere, you are taking up an entire day in travel time and resource access. It makes sense that when you can't meet the needs that are at the bottom of this pyramid, you're gonna struggle with a crisis somewhere along the way with the rest. We've got love and belonging on this pyramid. If you're struggling with mental health and you're alone and you don't have anywhere to be, it seems pretty reasonable to me that you're gonna have a bad day, that you're gonna get pretty upset, and you're gonna need someone to show up and chat with you, and I'm happy to be that person. I think we all need a little bit of support. 30% of our clients have serious and persistent mental illness. It becomes exponentially harder to meet the needs in that pyramid when you're struggling with a mental health issue. Navigating the systems that we have, one of the barriers to accessing care can largely be the symptoms of what you're working with. If you're in severe pain, how are you going to get to your appointment? If you are suffering from severe anxiety, how are you going to get to your appointment? The thing I really appreciate about Cahoots in a lot of ways is that we can truly meet you where you are, and you do not have to be, there's no expectations when we get there for you. When we look at the social determinants of health, these are the factors that influence people's health and wellness. Housing, for starters. And in Lane County, I highlight that we have around 10,000 people experiencing homelessness that we know of because they access services. And in our county, we have less than 500 shelter beds, which leaves at least 9,500 people, 9,500 people this winter that will be outside with no backup plan. That's a lot of people, and we worry about them a lot. And so part of our role as Cahoots is advocacy and drawing attention to these things and saying, just because you saw somebody outside and they look like they need to be inside, calling Cahoots doesn't necessarily fix that. Our access to shelters is not adequate. Healthy food is a social determinant of health, and low-income neighborhoods are typically more than a mile from a grocery store. Incarceration, poverty, environment. Low-income neighborhoods are often exposed to more environmental toxins as well. The education that you're able to get based on your neighborhood has an influence, and discrimination. At an individual level, discrimination results in physiological complications of stress. There's research to support that racism specifically leads to chronic stress illnesses, including heart disease and high blood pressure. And on a larger level, it negatively impacts health by interfering with all of the other social determinants of health. To highlight how much all of this overlaps, I like to look at housing discrimination. So let's say we group marginalized groups of people, how we do, in a less favorable area of town. It's common practice. And these areas are often more likely to have environmental hazards that lead to health issues. Due to barriers accessing the healthcare, distance, ability to travel, willingness to do so, treatment tends to cost more by the time it's received. Rather than being plugged in proactively and taking preventative measures, people will wait until it requires more intervention. Schools are not the same in all areas, which directly impacts income in the future, which impacts access to housing, and it becomes a loop. This concept naturally disproportionately affects people of color and people with mental health issues, which is why racism is a public health issue. And our inability to respond adequately to mental health is a public health issue. The American Public Health Association says, and I love this, that to assure that everyone has the opportunity to attain their highest level of health, we must address the social determinants of health and equity. It is a really big ask. It involves a lot of systems that work together to hold strong, clear lines between those who have more than enough and those who do not have enough. There are systems in place to maintain that status quo, and those are the systems that we need to address. My mission is to be a part of improving access equitably across the board, and right now for me that looks like working with Cahoots, because we will respond to anyone, anywhere, and it is free. Cahoots is only as strong as the resources that we have in our community, though. If you're having a crisis that requires a resource to resolve, and we don't have any resources to connect you with, we can hold space for you. We can make sure that you're not alone, and we can try to come up with a plan, but we can't necessarily resolve what is lacking for you. If it's a housing crisis and we have no shelter options, we can help you be a little bit warmer. We can offer you some gear, and we can reduce the harm, but we might not be able to solve it. We are grateful for the network of community support that exists in our area, but we're acutely aware that it's not enough on its own. And the pandemic, when it began, shut a lot of that down. And that's when it became really apparent that there's a lot of need. We respond sometimes when people are too intoxicated to be safe in public. And somebody might see them and worry about them and say, hey, this person seems like, they could use some support. We could easily transport that person to a sobering center. Let's say you've been drinking all day and you forgot to drink any water and you don't really have anywhere better to be, so you're just chilling, but you can't maintain yourself. That's an unsafe space to leave somebody in, right? They're vulnerable to a lot of things. If you can't get up and walk yourself somewhere else, I don't just want to leave you outside. However, in March, when we shut down, the sobering center shut down. We had a sobering center where you could just rest for the night or day and get up and go about your business when you were ready. And we didn't have that anymore. And that's when I realized without that, our only option was either to take you to the hospital, even though you don't need life-saving measures, you just need a little bit of safety, or leave you where you are. And that was a couple of months into my training, and that's when I realized how strongly Cahoots really is only as strong as what we have access to. Because otherwise, we got to get creative. I started with Cahoots in January, And I was training and learning about all the resources, and I was so excited about all of these things that we have in our area. And I was learning how to do crisis intervention, and I had just reached the second phase of my training when everything shut down. And everybody was stuck at home with whoever they lived with all the time. And as the shutdown progressed, I watched the effects of people being disconnected from their routines, of people being distant from their friends and unable to access their typical coping tools. People weren't able to go to the gym. They weren't able to go to the store freely. They weren't able to go and just walk around the mall if they felt like it. People had to be at home. And slowly, people started to figure out how to adjust. I learned how to provide crisis intervention that was less rooted in connecting you with a service and more rooted in holding space and coming up with plans and figuring out how to be safe with what we had to offer. I got more creative, I will give it that. And once we started to adjust, and as a community we started to adjust, May came and George Floyd was murdered. And nightly, this community was in the streets demanding change and often bringing up Cahoots. The movement to defund the police took off with what to me is unprecedented energy. The nation was crying for justice and for change all the way down to the streets of Eugene that were marched every night for weeks. People were clear about their requests, which included demands for more Cahoots. And for me, this was a really personally intense time. This concept matters to me more than I could express right now. And for the first time in this space, I realized how much bigger than me the work that I'm doing is, and the things that I'm talking about are. I took the death of my father and turned it into energy to be part of something different. The system that we have, Cahoots, is not perfect. It's not a cookie cutter solution, but it's not the same. It's not what we've always had. And that's what matters to me. I want to know that if somebody in the community is struggling with something, anything, and they think they need some support, that that support is available and it will show up and it will provide care that is rooted in acknowledging their humanity. As you can imagine, I had a lot to say on the topic. CNN decided they wanted Cahoots to present on live TV in the minutes right before they covered George Floyd's funeral. And I was asked to do that. It was my first media appearance. I was nervous to be on live TV, but I was not at all nervous about the content. I think about it all the time. It was present to me every day. Just because the nation's talking about it now doesn't mean it hasn't shaped 25 years of my life. Everything about my life had prepared me for that moment, and my time on the team with Cahoots had taught me that advocacy is number one. I had to say something. I had to acknowledge that this is not okay, and I had to acknowledge that there are other ways to do it. Cahoots, as designed by Whitebird, doesn't exist without a police department. That is part of our system. We are intertwined with them to offer a different service. We work for Whitebird. We're part of Whitebird. We just contract with them and communicate with them and are funded through them by the city. So we're connected, and I had to hold multiple truths. I had to hold the truth that Black lives matter. They matter now, they matter then, they will always matter. I also hold the truth that Cahoots is a direct partner of the Eugene and Springfield police departments, and my position on the team puts me in a place where I meet with them. I have meetings with them. I sit with them. And we talk about services and how to provide them and what we can do better and what we need to change. I have these conversations now. And I try to advocate for the community as much as I can in that space, because we're privileged, I think, to be a part of a system that so often holds observers out. And I think having an alternative in this area is part of what makes Eugene maybe a little bit safer. I think that people should have access to supports as they need supports, and sometimes that doesn't look like an armed response, and that's okay. There are other ways to respond to a crisis. And sometimes this gets really hard. And people will ask how I always have energy for it, and I just always answer that it matters enough. I ground myself by remembering that I'm just trying to help other people do the best that they can. And the more people in this job that I encounter and find out their story and what their barriers are and where they want to be, I find that it's never just one person's fault what their situation is. There's a lot of factors that go into what somebody's life looks like. And a lot of that is choices. So how do we start empowering people to make the choices they want to make rather than make the choices that they think is all they can do? Humans are social creatures and we're meant to support each other. I really love this quote by Coretta Scott King because she outlined that the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. When we're looking out for one another, we become our strongest selves. An entire community can rise when everybody in that community is supported to reach their fullest potential. When you're cast out of that group, when the community that you're a part of looks at you as an other, you're not worthy of the shelter or the food or the basic needs, it's damaging. It impacts the rest of your life. So I chose this work. I chose to meet everybody in this community exactly where they are, whether that's in their house or on the street or at the store, because I think that's how we should operate. I just don't understand why we would do anything else. I want the community to believe that public safety is safe, and anything that I can do to help that be true, I will do. All of this is bigger than me. Like, my heart was broken, my family's hearts were broken, but I am not alone in that. Not by a long shot. Using my voice to acknowledge that we have these disparities and that there are ways to creatively look at this system to bring change and acknowledge that the way that we've always done it doesn't mean that it's the right way to do it. I would say that all day, every day. I'll say it 800 times. I think that it's easy to forget that everything that's happening was somebody's idea once. They just had a thought, and somebody else liked it, and it just became what we know. But it doesn't mean it has to always be that way. So I would ask that anybody who's inspired by any of these pieces and any of these factors that influence community, just think about the thing that is the most outrageous to you. What is the thing that impacts others in the community that just horrifies you the most? And dig into that. Look into it. Figure out what's behind that. What's it about? And if something in that inspires you, like, maybe that's your path. I graduated nursing school and was offered a nursing job, and I said no, because this is what I need to be doing right now. It's not always about sticking with your plan or doing the thing that's going to make you the most money. Sometimes it's about figuring out how we can work together as a community to change the things that we think we know. Thank you for letting me talk to you today about this, and I'd be happy to answer questions and go over some of that with you.
Thank you, Ebony. Before we get to the Q&A, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So you can go ahead and sit. Okay. So, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. The following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Community of Oregon, and the Confederated Tribes of the Slits Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. From the Native Strategies Group. for the Q&A, we'll begin with some already pre-asked questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience or from anybody watching home from the Facebook Live or Instagram. So, Ebony, what's the most challenging situation you found yourself in as an emergency responder for Cahoots?
I would say one of the things that I consistently find the most challenging is running into the same crisis, like particularly housing crises, repeatedly, and not being able to provide that help and that support. And that's where that advocacy comes in, and making sure that we are speaking to the needs of the community and trying to get them acknowledged, because we can show up on scene a million times for you, but if what you're asking for is a safe shelter and we can't give you that, we're gonna have a repetitive crisis. And so that's where it can get a little bit challenging and defeating, and you start to like lose a little bit of hope. But you know, as a team, we debrief once a week and try to talk about it and make sure that we're all plugged in and we're connecting people with the best resources that we can, and get past that and stay hopeful and keep trying to create opportunities.
Thank you. And what is your fondest memory of your encounters with people who need your help and Cahoots' help?
My favorite memory is a call from really early in my time on the team. We were called out to something kind of domestic. There was a relationship involved, and what had turned out happening was this guy had kind of shut himself in the apartment, and he had a knife, and he was just locked in there, and he had threatened to hurt himself. And the neighbors were really worried, and so they called for police, and they showed up, and we showed up to provide support to the partner in the situation, some moral support. And ultimately, officers on the scene were like, it's not worth the safety risk of forcing entry into this apartment and potentially upsetting him and making it unsafe for everyone. So, you know, we're not sure how helpful we can be. And my partner was like, Ebony, you can talk to him. Why don't we just talk to him? And officers had asked for a description from the partner, and she had described him as really tall, really big, dark skin, and my own trauma started to inform this dynamic, right? And I was really worried. I was like, he's got this weapon, they're gonna like barge in there. So I was relieved to hear they weren't going to, but then I was like, why are the options that we either barge in there or we just leave? What else can we do? So I called him on the phone, and I said, listen, I'm gonna be really honest with you. There are a lot of officers out here. Like, this situation has gotten a lot of attention, and I wanna help you have a constructive outcome. I can't just let you stay in there and hurt yourself. I'm not willing to do that. I recognize that you're hurting, I recognize that you're frustrated, but I can't just leave you here. So would you be willing to come out and talk to me? And he was reasonably nervous about the amount of officers that he could see from where he was, and he's like, I don't wanna come out there. And I was in a position to advocate for him and say, listen, like, I feel safe with the person I'm talking to on the phone. So how about you come out, they'll just give you a quick pat down to make sure that you're not gonna hurt me, and then you and I can have a conversation. And we can get in the back of my van by choice, no handcuffs, no interaction with the officers at all, and we can get you the support that you need. And we'll just do that, and you get to choose to do that, and no one's forcing you to do anything, and it doesn't have to be punishment, it's help. And he did. He walked out, and we walked past this parade of officers, and he asked me if he could smoke a cigarette, and I was like, of course. It's your timeline. This is your crisis. You know, whatever you need to do is what I'm gonna support you to do. So we did, and then we got in the van, and I connected him with a resource that worked for him. And that's my favorite memory, because first, a response showed up that wound up not being the most helpful, and then we almost gave up on him. And then in the true nature of Cahoots, we got creative, and we talked about it, and the part of that story I left out was a lot of minutes of just listening, a lot of minutes of listening, and that's where the trust came in, right? People truly just want to be heard. I think that's the commonality between all of us, is that people just want to be heard and understood. And when we feel misunderstood, we start to react that way in some kind of way. We don't care for it very much. So that was a really nice opportunity to be able to offer that space and result in a constructive outcome.
Knowing that sometimes you're just going to be put on the spot in these situations, how do you mentally and prepare yourself the day of before a shift, knowing that you could be put on the spot in these dangerous and uncomfortable situations?
Well, I go to therapy once a week, and I very deliberately remind myself, like, none of this is about me. The call is not about me. None of it's going to be personal. Whatever this person says to me is really rooted in their experience. Like, I need to remember to provide the best service that I can, and that doesn't include prioritizing my own emotional response. So I go through the day prioritizing the client needs and the client expectations. And in between calls, my partner and I might talk about it, we might debrief about it and kind of touch base, like, how did that go? Did we feel good about that? To kind of get through. But really, first thing in the morning or first thing before my shift, I will just remind myself that I'm just there to help somebody else have the best outcome that they can. We're all just trying our best. And the thing that helps me stay grounded and overcome what is like supernatural levels of anxiety is just remembering that it's just an effort, and at least we're trying, you know? It's not gonna be perfect all the time. I can't fix everything. I don't always know what to say. I don't always know what's gonna feel supportive to somebody or not, and I might say something that they don't necessarily like even, but I tried, and at least the thing the person can take away is that someone showed up and cared enough to try.
And I know you touched base on it earlier, but could you please explain again what influenced your decision to become a nurse and how you switched over to becoming a crisis worker for Cahoots and what keeps you motivated and keeps you doing what you like to do?
Yeah. I was working in the emergency room and decided to go to nursing school. I wanted to be an emergency room nurse. And then I worked in the ER for a few years and realized it wasn't exactly my environment, but I still wanted to be a nurse, and I was halfway through that path. So I committed to it and got into nursing school, and in January, I was pretty close to graduation. I graduated in a few months, but I knew that if I didn't work for Cahoots now, if I hadn't applied in January, I was gonna graduate nursing school, I was gonna get a nursing job, and I was just gonna do that. And I would miss this opportunity to work with this group that I wanted to be a part of so badly. So I applied then and finished nursing school during a pandemic while training on Cahoots during a social justice movement. And in all of that chaos, when summer hit and I got my nursing license, I passed my test and I was ready and I was offered a job on my dream unit. It was so much chaos, and all I could do was stop and ask myself, like, what do I actually want? Like, what am I going to contribute to the community at this point that's going to feel the most helpful? Is it going to work at the hospital? And I couldn't tell myself that that answer was yes. I thought that the best way to show up for the community right now with the energy and the experience that I have and the passion and the effort I want to put into this was doing this and putting everything that I possibly can into Cahoots for as long as I can until something else makes more sense. But right now, this is what makes the most sense to me.
And with the ongoing pandemic, how has Cahoots transitioned from the very beginning when this first happened in March to now with it still continuing?
It's been an adjustment period, and we've had to change some of our things. It's really hard to have an empathetic face when you can't see your face. There's a certain amount of compassion that is portrayed by this 3/4 of my face, and you can't see it. So we've had to adapt some of our approaches, and we've, of course, adopted more stringent, like, cleaning and sanitization and trying to make sure that we're not contributing to the spread of the virus, as well as trying to acknowledge and keep up with the needs of the community that are changing because of the virus. And what we're coming into right now related to the pandemic is that last winter and many winters prior, there have been what are called warming centers. So when the weather starts to freeze, there are churches and different facilities that will open up their doors to people to get inside so that they're not just outside in the cold. And because of the pandemic, it's not clear how that would operate. We don't yet know, and this week it's supposed to freeze, and we have no idea what we're gonna do with the 10,000 people that are gonna be outside. So we're running into the same concepts and struggles that we've had as a community for a long time, but just in a different way. We're finding out as we go how the pandemic is impacting each of these different needs in our communities. And places that people used to be able to go and sit and eat are now just like grab and take only. And the way that we're able to connect people with services looks a lot different. If you've had a cough or a sneeze or a sore throat in the last 2 weeks or so, there's a lot of services you won't be able to access because the screening, and they can't take that risk. And it makes sense. Like, I'm not criticizing that process. As a nurse, I'm glad that we're doing screenings and not just like gathering together with symptoms. But it's also like, then what do we do? Like, now this person has a cough and we just like don't offer them services. So I think a lot of what's shifting is not just impacting Cahoots. It's a lot of ways that the community is having to adapt and figure it out. And we're just kind of there to support that process and try to help people as they run into barriers along the way, because the barriers during the pandemic seem to have gotten a little bit bigger and a little bit trickier to navigate, but people are out there trying.
And what training is necessary for those who are interested in working as a crisis worker and for Cahoots?
Some experience with mental health and what is helpful when people are in a crisis. Really, Cahoots is such a unique work environment that it's unlikely that we're going to get somebody who knows how to do Cahoots, right? Unless like they've already done it with us and they're coming back. So there's a lot of room for teaching, and that's why there's so many hours of training that we'll do at the beginning. But that fundamental understanding of like mental health and crisis and how to navigate that is really key. To come on in the medical role, we can accept an EMT basic license or higher, and a nursing license will also allow you to be a medic on the team. So for the medical roles, there's licensure requirements, and for the crisis worker roles, it's kind of an experience exposure-based thing. If people are interested, I would always encourage them to apply. I think that if you have a passion for any of the things I've talked about today, like there's room for that, and it takes all kinds of people to get Cahoots to work.
And where can people go to apply? Just online?
Mm-hmm. On the Whitebird website, there's a job section. And when we're hiring, there's a link up there to submit the applications.
Do you guys offer services like shadowing before officially trying to apply?
If we're interested in an applicant, we can offer what we call a ride-along, and someone can come and see what we do. Right now, we're not offering ride-alongs just generally because of the pandemic. It's kind of a high risk. The risk outweighs the benefit of that right now. So hopefully we can change that soon, but who knows? But at this point, yeah, before we're gonna like formally onboard you and offer you that job, we're gonna let you get on the van and see what it's really about, because it's a unique setup.
Awesome. Okay. Are there any questions from the audience or for those at home watching? Yeah, and then I'll.
So I have somebody who asked, which cities, countries are asking Cahoots for advice on how to provide alternatives to policing, and there's a follow-up to that same question. It says, how have the asks changed over time?
Okay, so the question that was asked was what countries, cities, and sorry.
Are asking
are asking Cahoots for advice, or that are also interested in trying to bring Cahoots?
There's a significant amount of interest, especially lately, from all corners of the nation. I've been having conversations with I feel like all 50 states. There's a real effort, I think, in California to kind of understand it, and I know that there are other areas that are trying to adopt models after coming and like visiting our area and checking it out. The interest is so significant that Whitebird developed a consulting department to handle those calls and to handle that interest and develop a kind of curriculum that we can share with other areas. So if there's another area that truly, like another police department or another city agency that wants to figure out what it really looks like we have a true consulting department that they can have conversations with and get to understand the inner workings of the program and how you actually bring it to life in your city and in your space. So we do that to varying degrees, and I know that we've gotten a significant amount of interest from California, but we've been speaking to people from all over. I think what inspires me the most right now and what I get really excited about is that other areas are considering this, they're thinking about it, and at least talking about it. So we're getting to a space where people are willing to consider what alternatives might look like and what it might look like to offer a different service. And I think that's really neat. So the answer to that is vaguely like a lot. A lot of areas have a lot of interest, and I think our consulting department's having a hard time keeping up.
And then the other one I have here from somebody is, what can local residents do to support Cahoots, and how should we be advocating for more local resources?
So the question asked was, what can local residents do to help support Cahoots, and what can they do to allocate more resources?
Supporting Cahoots can look a lot of different ways, and it depends on what you've got available. We don't necessarily have volunteers on the van, right? So we can't do it in that capacity, but there are a lot of inner workings at Whitebird that volunteers are really helpful for. So there's that piece. If you've got time to spare, you could consider volunteering with Whitebird. As far as support, we always will welcome donations of gear, of warm supplies, whatever makes sense, whatever you might have extra of. And those can be taken to the main Whitebird location. And I think really properly utilizing Cahoots is one of the best ways to support us. And what I mean by that is calling us when there's a need for us. Absolutely. That's what we're here for. And otherwise, I think about maybe in some instances, we'll see somebody, and this makes sense to me, you'll see somebody out and about who's behaving in a way that you wouldn't, right? Let's say somebody's having a conversation with a tree, and you wouldn't do that. So you're like, are they okay? I don't think they're okay. And you maybe want to get them some help, and you might call Cahoots, right? But if we get there and they're like, this is my Tuesday, so if you could just let me do this, that'd be great. And we're like, sure, you're not hurting anybody, you're not in any danger, if you're good, I'm good with that. We do a lot of that. And so one thing that I tend to recommend to folks is that if you're comfortable, and if you're not, then don't, but if you're comfortable, just asking if people want something. I respond on a lot of calls where people are like, I don't understand why people don't just ask me. I'm fine. Why do they think I want something? Do I look like I just want something? I'm like, I don't know. I guess you want some water? I got water. I can. No. But I get it. We see somebody and we want to support them. We see that they're struggling. But sometimes people are just doing the best they can and they don't want anything. So just touching base and saying, hey, do you want me to call Cahoots for you? Is a good way to make sure we're making the most of our time. I think there was a second part to that question that was good too.
How can we advocate for more?
Perfect. Let the city know that that's what you want, and let your representatives know that that is what you want. We have a community voice, and it is our responsibility to use it. and say, like, this is what we expect. People, for example, will call a lot on people that are camping in parks in their neighborhood. And I get it. Like, that's your park. You want it to be open. Like, you don't want people in it. Fine. But can I ask you where you want them to go? Because, like, I don't think any of us thought about that. You just don't want them to be there. You don't want to have to see it. And that's sure. But what if instead we reached out to our city officials and we said, I think that having 490 something shelter beds for a homeless community of 10,000 people is not adequate, and I would like us to do something about it. I think advocating to the people that have the power to make those decisions is the best way to get that out.
Any other questions? Yes.
My question is kind of related to actually a ballot measure this year, Measure 110, which is like dealing with drug decriminalization and like treating it as a public health issue. I was just curious how Cahoots handles issues like that where there is a criminal penalty, but like it is something that has more public health relevance. And if that measure passes, do you think that's going to change how you handle like drug use and that sort of thing?
So Measure 110 is something that Whitebird has decided to support. And I think that it will have a lot of changes if it were to pass, including kind of some of our approach. I think that as Cahoots, our goal is never to deal with a criminal component, right? Like, that's not our job. So decriminalizing something that we encounter pretty often makes sense to me. As a city contracted entity, putting our name on something political to that degree is something that I try to be careful about. But I do think from a public health standpoint that acknowledging substance use as a reasonable response to a lack of other options is something that, when you think about it, ultimately should result in supports instead of criminalization, right? Like, we're acknowledging, like, you got here because of whatever it was that got you here. And if you're asking to not be coping in this way anymore, how can we support you to do that? But people have choice. And so, you know, from a harm reduction standpoint, if that's what you're going to do, how can we just help you do that in the safest way? So those are the lenses that we kind of apply on that concept, but that's a good question.
Next question.
I have another one from Instagram Live, and they are asking if you are currently working on any new or additional programs for Cahoots.
The question from Instagram Live is if you are working with any new or additional programs for Cahoots.
We are working on making sure that the services we provide are informed and careful and thoughtful. And with the current nature and like starting this spring, we have been doing trainings and trying to come to understand as a larger group the impacts of race on socioeconomic status and the way that you're going to navigate the world, and not accepting that we've become part of a system that has these systemic issues and just adopting them, but how do we deliberately be different? The most recent training we did was a restorative justice training to look at how we build up supports, even like within the program for ourselves, instead of having punitive responses to things that go wrong. And how can we model that ourselves and then project that out into the community? So right now, we're focused more on making sure that we're providing quality, informed, equitable services than we are on trying to provide anything new. We want to make sure that we're being responsible. And when the nation and internationally people are looking to us because we don't exist anywhere else and they want inspiration, we feel like we have an obligation to present the best program that we can. So rather than trying to create something new, we're trying to make sure that we are doing the best we can at what we already do. And we found that there's room for improvement. So that's what we're working on.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Ebony, for taking the time out to come and speak with us. And I'd also like to thank the B-Series team for putting this all together. Thank you, Natalie, our social media coordinator, Alice, our logistics coordinator, Luquaya, our outreach coordinator, Valerie, our QFF coordinator, and Suzanne, our advisor. And thank you those who came in person and to those watching at home. Please join us next time, November 24th, for Be Engaged with Sven Hawkinson. Have a good night.
Thank you.